How's it going, guys? It's Eclipse here and welcome back to the series in which we look at every single tank from the tech trees within World of Tanks, and of course today we are looking at the British tech trees. So hopefully you guys are going to enjoy this and find it useful. I will timestamp every single line. We'll go through line by line, and what I mean by that is the entire tech tree line leading up to a tier 10 or tier 10s in the game, and then you can jump around to the vehicles that you want and you can see what the different tech trees are like, and of course get what you want from the video. And then at the end of this series we'll be joining them all into one video where you can see every single tank in the game in the tech tree, and of course my mini reviews on each of them. So hopefully you guys do enjoy, and I guess we might as well start straight away, and we'll start from the top, which is essentially the British light tanks leading up to the Manticore. So we'll start with the tier 5, since the tier 4 and tier 3 aren't really kind of something that everyone will use. So the tier 5 is the Crusader, and the Crusader is a light tank that is very interesting. I mean, it doesn't really provide too much in the way of being particularly great within the game. It doesn't particularly have a whole lot of memorable features within it, and in general you're probably going to find this thing pretty boring to play, but it is one of those tanks that will probably give you a nice little starter into the tech tree line, more so than the previous vehicles that you've played, since it does have a little bit more of the kind of attributes that a lot of the mediums and the light tanks will have as you go through the line. And it can go top speed 44 kilometers an hour, nothing absolutely outrageous with that. And of course, yeah, it's kind of the main weak point of this tank is that it's supposedly a medium light tank in quotation marks, but it isn't that fast. And of course, yeah, just, I don't know, not particularly my most favoured vehicle in the game, but you know, you'll get through it pretty quickly. And then it leads on to one of the more interesting vehicles, and actually one of the best tier 6s in the British tech tree, and that is the Cromwell. And the Cromwell is an absolutely outstanding vehicle. This thing is one that I must have gone ahead at some point and 3-marked. I have currently bought it back when it was on sale, as I always recommend you guys do when you find a tank that you really enjoy. But as you can see, the tank has multiple different guns. You have 5 different guns that you can use on this thing, and for me personally, we will purchase them right here since it's going to be useful for you guys to see the different attributes of them all. It does get a howitzer, which is basically a giant derp gun, and that can be used potentially, but I wouldn't necessarily rely on using the howitzer since it has pretty awful penetration on its HE and its heat, with 370 damage and awful accuracy. And when you're going 65 kilometers an hour that this tank can go, yeah, I mean, it just doesn't really hit all too often, so it's pretty pointless. But the other guns on this tank, now that is something completely different. You have this 6-pounder, you've got a 75mm and a ultimate 75mm, which is essentially the top tier package, and it is the one that I would always go for when playing in the Cromwell, because it has both the penetration values that you need at tier 6, as well as also having a decent amount of alpha damage, but having the reload to be able to track opponents and keep them tracked to the point where you're able to really deal a significant amount of damage. And so yeah, really nice, as well as having a good speed, 64 kilometers an hour. You also have not really any armor, so to say. I mean, you may be able to bounce 2 tiers lower and stuff like that, but yeah, nothing too outrageous in that regard. But yeah, you do have a good view range, especially when you start putting equipment on this thing, which I'd highly recommend you use advanced optics, and then ventilation and rammer in this thing. I mean, you could use speed boost maybe, but it's not necessarily useful. I guess we can put equipment, so you'll see the slight boost to the damage per minute that this can provide, and I'd highly recommend using enhanced combat rations if you can afford it at all. That should be your first premium consumable that you put on this thing. And yeah, just a really good tank. I really enjoyed it, and I think this is one of the best of the line. And then since we're on the light tanks, it splits from the Cromwell being both the medium line and the light tanks. But then we go on to the Setter. Now the Setter is a vehicle that I played a little bit of. I pretty much just got the next tank and moved on. I didn't sit around and try and grind out any more. But essentially this tank is a really small vehicle. Think of it like the British version of the ELC, but it's a lot taller and not quite as small. So it is a similar sort of tank. It is basically a fast vehicle, and at that point not even that much faster than a lot of the mediums in the game. I mean, you can see here the Comet goes 51 kilometers an hour, the light tank goes 58, and that's the real problem that this vehicle has, is that it can move forward, it can do what it needs to do, but it doesn't have outstanding stats in any regard, and probably makes this thing a little bit tedious for a lot of people to play. So I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to purchase it, but it is pretty decent, I guess, as you go through. And the better that you are at the game and the more experienced you are in light tanks, this tank actually becomes probably pretty good, since you can get good camo and good view range to start using the true spotting that the British line offers you, as opposed to the kind of more aggressive spotting and damage that you might be able to do in some of the other vehicles in the game. But you come away from the Setter feeling, you know, like it wasn't a bad experience, good one, and that's pretty much my opinion of this tank. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get any armor or anything like that, so don't worry about that. And then you move on to the LHM-TV, which is the tier 8, and this is a tank that was, yeah, I mean, this tank was very weird. It looks kind of cool, but it does get slightly more alpha damage than the previous vehicle. So as you go through, you're able to pick up an 85mm on this tank, making it slightly more usable, at least when you're coming into brawls. It's faster, it has better camo, it has more view range, and therefore this tank becomes probably where the light tank line on this is kind of very, very good to, you know, medium to very good. And I find this tank is definitely down to people's playstyles. If you like super fast firing tanks, this tank line is just not for you. I mean, the Manticore is definitely not for you if you're after a damage dealing light tank. But it does have high alpha, and this trails all the way through the line. I mean, relative to the mediums, it has a similar sort of kind of gun, but it isn't necessarily as good as the mediums would get. But yeah, that's why you get the extra view range, the better concealment, and yeah, overall the LHM, it was okay, it was good. And then we move on to the tier 9, and this is the G-Saw. The G-Saw is yet again another one that I found a bit weird to play. It does get the 240 alpha damage of the 90mm as opposed to the 230mm or the 230 damage on the 85, and this kind of, it helps, but it's literally 10 damage, and when you're at tier 9 you can feel a little bit lackluster when you're coming up against tanks. And considering the fact that the reload of the tank is about 10 seconds, or just less than 10 seconds to deal 240 damage, you're feeling rather worse for wear with its 1400 damage per minute. So not particularly the most fun tank in the game to use, but it can work, and it's primarily focused around actually doing true spotting in the game and being the spotter for your team to get assistance damage as opposed to real damage. And yeah, I kind of enjoyed this tank, but obviously didn't enjoy it too much to keep it in the garage, so you can kind of get an idea there. And then you move on to the tier 10, the Manticore, and the Manticore, when you compare it to some of the other tier 10 light tanks, is lackluster, so to say, because of the fact that the damage per minute absolutely sucks. I mean, it's 1700 damage per minute at tier 10, which means that tier 6 tank destroyers have more damage per minute than you, and they probably have around the same sort of penetration on their premium rounds as you have on your standard, but of course they're 4 tiers lower than you. But this vehicle still can perform quite well, even if you do have to use quite a few of those APCR rounds when you're coming up against heavy tanks at the tier. It yet again very much features about the view range, and you want to be making sure that you are using this tank with its view range to really make it work properly, because you need the assistance damage to change your game from being, you know, reliant on dealing damage with other light tanks to, yeah, basically maintaining the combined damage of other light tanks by getting that assistance. 68 kilometers an hour as well, pretty decent, and it makes it a slightly fast kind of light tank for the tier, but not anywhere near the fastest in the game. But yeah, really do enjoy playing the Manticore. It's a challenge, and that is pretty much the entire tech tree in terms of the light tanks. And yeah, they are all a challenge, and they're probably not the first light tanks that you want to go down if you are trying to get a light tank in the game. Jumping back down to tier 7, we have the Comet, and this is a vehicle I loved, and it is a vehicle that I find very fun to play because of the fact that it has, much like the Cromwell, a really fast firing gun that is actually super powerful at the tier if you can keep it singing, and that is really the kind of the ultimate thing about the Comet, and we'll fully kit it out here so you can see the different guns. And essentially it has the derp gun that the Cromwell has. I would never ever recommend it ever. And then you of course go all the way up to this 140 alpha damage gun that we have here, the 77mm with 0.34 accuracy, really good, and of course a decent top speed as well, and it has a pretty decent terrain resistances and dispersion whilst moving to allow for you to essentially be very accurate whilst being in the kind of hill areas. It has 10 degrees of gun depression, I believe, 12 degrees of gun depression, sorry, which makes it really good at fighting on ridge lines. And that's why I love this tank, is because it's really fast at firing, it gets okay penetration, it gets decent speed, damage sucks, but it can retrack opponents, it can damage people, keep them locked in place, and you can get a lot of assistance damage from that, as well as the fact that it has okay view range to be able to spot for your team as well. And yeah, I overall just really like the Comet. Is it overpowered? Is it amazing? No. Is it good? Yes. Is it good for a new player? Probably not. I don't think this tank is particularly that fun for most people. It doesn't have any armor, and yeah, I think that people will struggle with this thing until you've had a little bit of experience playing in World of Tanks. Then maybe go for this one. Then we move on to the Centurion, and although the Centurion is a good tank when it's fully upgraded, I have to mention the stock grind of the Centurion is horrific. This tank was absolutely useless. You end up with a tier 6 gun at tier 8, meaning that you have 200 pen with 150 damage when you're a tier 8 medium. You're coming up against light tanks that are dealing nearly twice the damage that you will be dealing, and it makes it very frustrating. And when you couple that with the fact that you don't get the top turret, meaning people can pen your turret when you don't have it fully upgraded, and you have terrible armor on the hull of the tank, meaning that everyone can hit that big lower plate and even pen the upper plate as well, and then the side armor's garbage. Yeah, you feel like at the beginning of playing this tank it is just hot garbage and it should probably go in the bin. But don't worry, it does get better. And when you are fully upgraded, your turret becomes much stronger in terms of its armor. You get a lot faster, you're no longer as sluggish, and the top 20 pounder is much better for being able to deal consistent damage to your opponents and coming away with some really good wins. I do really like this tank when it's fully upgraded, but stock, it is awful, and it is going to be horrible for you guys to play. Then, you know, once you've completed this grind, I'm sure you'll kind of be in the same sort of boat where you think it's a good tank, but it definitely does need to be fully upgraded. And then this one leads on to the Centurion 7/1, as the name implies, the next one in the line. And essentially this vehicle is yet again a one that I found to be quite good. It gets 105mm as the top package, which has 390 damage, and of course has Hesh rounds as well, which is a big win for a tier 9 medium in the game, because you're able to use those Hesh rounds to great effect to be able to do a lot more damage at the tier. And especially when you're coming up against tier 7 tanks like the Tiger, they are basically a heaven for you to grind through and be able to get that increased damage per minute from using Hesh rounds. and the tank itself is very good when you're fully upgraded. The top turret is really good as well and will allow you to bounce a hell of a lot more shells. You can see the armor of the top turret here. You can see it's pretty strong, and although you know you do have a cupola, it's actually fairly slim to be able to hit it reliably for the most part, and often you'll bounce off of the cupola if you hit the wrong angled area. So yeah, I really love this tank. I thought it was a brilliant one. And once again, it is probably very much dependent on how much experience of World of Tanks you have as to whether you can make this work, since its premium rounds aren't particularly forgiving if you do manage to use them, which because they are the Hesh rounds and therefore you don't actually get that much penetration. So whatever your standard pen of the Top Gun is your actual maximum penetration. So yeah, not particularly the most fun, but don't worry, because it leads on to the Centurion Action X and the FV4202. And both of these tanks are some of my favourite mediums in the game. And although the Centurion Action X is probably kind of shoved in the back of the World of Tanks kind of overpowered vehicles, I mean, this tank is not particularly great. I've played it quite a bit. I did enjoy playing it. I think it's really good when you can get it working as intended, but in today's meta it kind of suffers, because although it has the good alpha damage, although it has good premium penetration and decent HE rounds with 105 pen with 480 alpha, yeah, the overall aspect of the tank, it's pretty slow, it's pretty sluggish, it's huge, and it doesn't have any armor really, and that basically means that most people are going to pen you. You're going to deal with the same amount of damage on average to whatever you're meeting, if not receive more damage. You don't get that much health, and yeah, you got good view range, but that is pretty much it. And although the damage per minute of this vehicle is very good, and you're able to kick out quite a lot when you're fully upgraded, or not fully upgraded, but when you've got all of your kit in the tank to be able to boost it up with enhanced combat rations, with the advanced loader, and of course putting in a commander will help significantly in this tank. Yeah, you can make this thing really good, but do I think that everyone is going to enjoy playing in it? Probably not. I think that you would be far better saving your credits to be able to get the FV4202, which is the alternate British medium, and this one is actually one of my favourites in the game, because although it doesn't have the highest top speed, it's lower than the Centurion Action X, you get a lot better armour. I mean, this thing is a slimmer profile, and although the armour itself is not that thick, because of the angling of this thing and because the lower plate's a lot smaller, people often miss the lower plate, because obviously if you're wiggling side to side and they hit at a ridiculous angle, and often they'll be looking down onto the lower plate, meaning that it becomes even more of a harder angle for them to do. And if they auto aim, you can bounce quite a few rounds in this thing, whereas the Action X, for example, if we were to go back to the armour, it's a lot flatter if they auto aim, so even if they do not aim whatsoever, they're going to be able to pen you for the most part. And of course you can see the size profile between the two different tanks here, and I mean the contrast is just massive. I mean literally the Action X is gigantic in comparison to the FV4202, and the armour is just better on the smaller one, so of course that is a big advantage. And the turret armour is also pretty decent. It can be penned by a few tanks in the game, but of course it requires premium, as you'd expect, but that's the same for the Action X as well. And you do maybe suffer on the kind of a few other aspects, which is that the top penetration is of course your standard rounds. This one gets Hesh, so although you have 268mm on your standard rounds, you don't have any possibility of increasing that because of the 210mm Hesh round pen, which deals 480 damage, so an extra 90 damage, which can come in crucial in wanting to be able to kick out a lot of damage, because it has just an insane rate of fire, which if you then add in those Hesh rounds with that 210 pen, and a lot of tanks can be penned with that, by the way, you're able to essentially kick up an extra, what, like 20% more damage on every shot you fire, and you know, you can deal a lot of damage to tracks, which means you get assistance from that as well, since you'll do more module damage with the Hesh rounds than you will with an AP or standard round in this vehicle. So yeah, I really love the FE4202. It's my favourite of the two, but both are still very, very good. And at some point I will actually sit down and try and grind out the third mark for the FE4202 when I got a bit of time. But yeah, definitely some brilliant medium tanks in the game, and hopefully you did enjoy this. But it's time to move on to the heavy tanks, and by heavy tanks there are a ton of them in the game. So let's jump down to tier 5 to the Churchill 1. So the Churchill 1, what is so special about this vehicle? Well, it is the first kind of heavy tank that you'll find in the game, and it essentially relies on having thick armor. And this tank, tier for tier, actually has some decent armor, so you're able to bounce quite a few rounds at the tier. Tier 7s and tier 6s will probably pen you most of the time, since the flat plates don't really work against the higher tier vehicles, since they just have the penetration values to go through them. But either way, it is very, very good at the tier, and it kind of teaches you how to side scrape, since you got this spaced armor on the side, which is that big flat plate that's on the side of the tank, which is probably easier to see on the side here, which allows you to side scrape out. The tracks are exposed, however, which means that people can track you quite easily. They can really easily see that front drive wheel, which is exposed and doesn't have any kind of hiding or flashings that go over the top of it to avoid you being able to visually see them. So they're really easy to track this thing. And that means that, yeah, you will definitely want to be training up some form of repairs on your vehicle in this thing in your commander. But this tank really a decent one at the tier, and the main armament is actually a really fast firing 75mm, or you could go with a 6-pounder. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think going with the fast firing 75mm of the Top Gun is just the way to go, and you'll be able to really be a nuisance to a lot of tanks at the tier. But moving on, we do have two options. We've got the Churchill GC, and I guess since we're here, I will actually showcase this thing, since, you know, it's not really a part of the tank destroyer line, even if it is a tank destroyer. But essentially, the Churchill GC is a vehicle that is a Churchill that is essentially the Churchill, which is the Churchill on the tech tree line, which is Churchill 7, but it is a slightly modified variant which doesn't have a turret. And the Churchill GC, as if any of you know about this vehicle, is absolutely useless for the most part. It's a meme in the community that this thing is always picked when people are doing kind of, I don't know, community voted tanks to play, because it is a giant box that has no angling, and the armor is pretty awful. I mean, it has 152mm of flat, and I mean absolutely flat armor on the front, meaning that any tank that has any level of penetration above that is going to go right through this thing. So that is tier 8s, tier 7s, and pretty much a lot of tier 6s will be able to actually go through the front of this thing very easily. And that's not taking into account that the lower plate of this thing is actually pretty big as well, and has 139mm. So yeah, I mean, not a fun tank in terms of its armor, but surely it gets something about this tank that's going to be able to be good. Well, maybe, and that is the main armament, because this has 280 damage and really good penetration for the tier. It's actually a very solid 32-pounder on this thing, meaning that you can be quite dominant if you can continuously fire in this tank without getting taken out. But the not getting taken out part is the primary thing. And because the gun arc of this thing is absolutely useless, I mean, you can see how much it can turn side to side here just by where the ball is behind the tank, and that means that, yeah, you're not going to be able to look left and right very far with this non-turreted tank destroyer. So although you have a good gun, in order to make it work, you have to turn all of the time, and in which case a lot of vehicles can avoid your shell since you won't be fully aimed, and that kind of sucks. As well as when you combine it with the fact that the engine is only top speed of 25.7 kilometers an hour, yeah, you ain't getting anywhere fast either. So it's slow, it doesn't have any armor, it has a good gun, in fact almost very good gun on a tier 6. but that's it. That is literally it. Doesn't even get a decent amount of hit points, 650 with this thing. So yeah, it just kind of sucks. But so if you're going towards the Badger or the FV215B, go to the 88 because this is actually good, and we'll get onto it later. But back to the Churchill 7, which is what the Churchill GC is kind of based off of, the chassis of the vehicle. And this tank is a completely different story. This is actually pretty good because although it does get the same sort of plates on this vehicle where you can be penned quite easily, the lower plate is the exact same, the upper plate has similar sort of armour, but they're a lot smaller. People don't often kind of aim fully at this tier, so you can bounce quite a few rounds, and if they do aim, they will pen you, but remember that these tanks are all based around having damage per minute, so you actually can out DPM a lot of the tanks that you play up against because you have that fast firing gun, and when you are fully upgraded, of course, you'll end up with this 77mm, which is actually quite good and consistent to be able to get you lots of damage over time. And I'd really recommend you use it. I think that this tank is actually pretty okay. It's not fast either, but it has, you know, a little bit of armor that can be worked, and I think it is it's an okay tank at the tier, and I think it's pretty good. But then we move on to tier 7, and this comes in both a tank that I actually really enjoyed, even if there is some real horrible controversial opinions about this tank. So there is one side that really love the tank, there is another side that absolutely think it's just horrible and a terrible tank, and the majority of people are probably on the this is a horrible tank to play and is pretty useless, but for me, I found this tank actually had a really nice main armament because you can deal 150 damage and it can deal damage at about 4 seconds when you're fully upgraded. So it deals a lot of damage every single time you fire, or every single minute, because you're dealing so much damage over the time that you can keep this thing firing. And often, if you know where to hit tanks in their weak points, if you're looking at tracks, trying to track people, keep them locked in place, this thing is absolutely nothing better. And even if you come up against tanks like, for example, the IS-3 or some of the heavy tanks that can whack you for 390, because the penetration doesn't suck on this tank, you can actually, if you're good at aiming, be able to pin them down, and you pen them every single time, and often in the time it takes for them to reload 1 shell, you will have done 3 or maybe even 4 shells, which will be more than likely more damage than they will have dealt to you. And if you can side scrape in this thing, you can avoid taking any damage if they just hit your tracks or whatever it might be. Yeah, I really did think that this tank was actually kind of underrated. I'm not going to say it's overpowered or anything like that. This Black Prince is far from overpowered, but it's definitely kind of thought of as a heavy tank in the sense that you should just be able to YOLO these high alpha heavy tanks at the tier, but it is not that. It is a purely catching people off guard and then ruining their day, and that is what the Black Prince does, because yeah, if you can basically wait for your opponents to fire so you miss out on taking any damage and then you lock them in place, maybe you take 1 shell of damage in return, but I can guarantee if you take 1 shell having them missed, the first one, then you're going to be able to almost full health them in the time that they can get off another shell. So yeah, I absolutely love the Black Prince in my opinion, but I definitely don't think it is the norm, and for the majority of players, probably more an experienced player's tank to actually get, in my opinion. But then moving on, we have the Caernarvon, and the Caernarvon is a horrible tank to play. I absolutely despise this tank, and I actually played it back when the top turret was much weaker. Now, granted, the turret has been buffed and it makes the tank a hell of a lot better, but the Caernarvon stock is, yet again, like the Centurion, absolutely horrifically dung beetle in the game, and that means that yeah, you're slow, you can't move because you don't have the engine upgrades and it takes actually quite a while to get them. The turret absolutely sucks on the standard tank, so yeah, you end up with like the Centurion turret, and then you have to wait until the very end package to be able to get the top gun, because it should be the case that you have 150 damage at tier 8 in a heavy tank. Yeah, 150 damage in a tier 8 heavy tank. And don't worry, you only have to grind out like 100 and something thousand XP to get the top gun, because it's the last thing that you can purchase in the game, because Wargaming really care about your experience when playing this vehicle. And yeah, that is pretty much it. It's a horrible grind till you get fully upgraded, and then it becomes much better, and you'll probably start enjoying this tank after that. But remember, don't give up on it too soon, because it does get a whole lot better. And then leading on to the next one, this is quite possibly the best tier for tier heavy tank at tier 9. In my opinion, it is super powerful, and that's because this tank has just everything that you could possibly want. It has turret armor, it has good gun depression, it has decent mobility, nothing insane, but it is able to get forward. It has really good accuracy, it has amazing damage per minute for a tier 9 heavy that has the alpha that this tank does. It gets a 120mm, meaning it has 400 alpha damage every single shot, and reloads in about 9 seconds roughly, maybe slightly less even than that. So yeah, I mean, this tank is just perfect in every way. It has decent view ranged when you get it fully upgraded, of course. You can see here it gets just increased health as well, and yeah, this tank is just outrageously good when it is buffed up to its top level. And yeah, I really do enjoy this tank. I think everybody who plays it will be very thankful that it's the Conqueror you have to play in order to get all 3 of the tier 10s in the game, needing over, what, like 900,000 XP in total. So you have to play the Conqueror a ton to be able to get all 3 of the FE215B, the Super Conqueror and the Chieftain Mark 6, but it is a tank that you will not have to really bash your head against the brick wall in order to play. So hopefully that gives you a little kind of sigh of relief, rather than having to play a tank like the Carnarvon, for example, for that many games. And yeah, I guess it's time to go on to the tier 10s, which start off with the FE215B. Now there's 3 heavy tanks, like we've mentioned, and each one has a similar, well, one sort of aspect about each tank that is better than the other, as you'd expect. Now, these aspects don't necessarily always fall in line with the meta, and then some do fall in line with the meta, but what definitely doesn't fall in line with it is the FE215B, because this tank, it's slow. I mean, this tank is not particularly fast. It has an amazing gun, and that is the key thing about this tank. It has good damage per minute and is kind of trying to be the Conqueror at tier 10, but of course rear mounted, and yeah, just not as good turret armor tier for tier as the Conqueror in my opinion. The hull armor of the tank is actually kind of annoying, because what you'll find with this tank is that although you can side scrape with this thing, you'll see that there is this jagged corner that comes out below the turret. Now this corner here, or those corners, I'll try and highlight them here so you can see them. So essentially on this corner you'll find that there's a lot of problems that can arise, because you try and side scrape out and they will essentially just pen you through that little flat plate that is below the turret there. And this is a really annoying point, and anyone that knows about it, you know, and you'll be able to pen this thing every single time, even if it is angling perfectly. There's nothing you can do about it, as well as having the turret weak point that the Conqueror and the Super Conqueror have on that top of it, and then having the big lower plate as well. So yeah, kind of annoying to play up against, but other than that, I mean, the tank kind of sucks. I mean, it doesn't get that many rounds. You have 35 rounds, and trust me, that seems like a lot, but 35 rounds is actually only capable of dealing 14,000 total damage, which, I mean, yeah, sounds like tons of damage, but that means that if you want to have a 10k damage game, you have to hit 75% of every single round that you fire. And it's probably actually slightly less than that maybe. But that is ridiculous. I mean, to be able to actually deal over 10k, you have to hit all of those and you have to pen them all. So yeah, it's not particularly fun in that regard, and you do run out of rounds because it does fire so quick. And the fact that that is even a somewhat of a balancing feature, I mean, this tank isn't overpowered anyway, but the fact that that is a limitation to this vehicle is just it's just annoying, and Wargaming should probably change it. But, you know, hey ho, we'll probably not see it. And the fact that this tank is so big as well, even more annoying that it's only carrying 35 rounds. But, you know, historical accuracy, maybe, I don't even know. But, you know, Wargaming really care about historical accuracy when they've got things like the machine in the game. But either way, the FV215B, it is a good tank. It's probably enjoyed by a smaller proportion of players in the game, and they will love it. They will really find this tank amazing. But the people who are general players of the game will probably find it very average, as I find it very average. And although you can have good games in it because of that damage per minute, it just doesn't have everything that the other vehicles have. And talking about the other vehicles, we have the Super Conqueror, and the Super Conqueror is one of the most easy to play vehicles that you'll ever play in World of Tanks, because it has basically everything that you could possibly want, and you don't have to really think too much when playing it. So it has 10 degrees of gun depression for starters. It gets really good accuracy. You can see here 0.32 accuracy rivaling mediums. It gets 3,200 damage per minute, which at tier 10 in a heavy tank is really good. It gets 400 alpha. It has the turret armor of a Conqueror, but has spaced armor, which basically means none of those kind of cheeks of this vehicle can be penned very easily. And you can see it here, those big spaced purpley plates that are kind of come up, are very common to see this thing in the game. It also has a plate on the upper plate that acts as spaced armor, which means that the upper plate is basically unpennable for most people. And then yes, it does have the big lower plate, but it is kind of difficult to pen. And like the FV215B, it does have a plate that when you side scrape they can hit because it comes flat. But of course, the Super Conqueror being super, this plate is 10 times thicker than the FV215B, meaning that it's actually not an easy weak point to pen, but it is still there. So yeah, I mean, the Super Conqueror, a dominant heavy tank, and I would highly recommend that every new player to the game would grind towards the Super Conqueror, as it's going to be a pleasant experience all the way through to the top. And yeah, I mean, the HE rounds of this thing are perfect as well, with 120 pen, which is almost unheard of on the HE rounds at the tier, although it is British, so you know, you're expecting to have much better HE rounds. But yeah, either way, a very good vehicle, and I really love it. And then of course you move on to the other tank at this tier, which is the Super Chieftain, or it's not actually called the Super Chieftain, but it is a Chieftain Mark V. And although this isn't as good as the premium tier 10 Chieftain that you can get within the game, because of course it has to be worse than the premium version, but this tank has 270 pen, which is ridiculous. It has the same alpha damage, but of course the standard rounds being APCR or APDS, it's the same thing. It goes super fast, and essentially you have really good penetration for the tier. And that means that you're able to basically pen everything with standard. It means you don't have to fire that much premium. And then of course you get really good Hesh rounds as well, 140 pen, really good. And this tank once again has very good damage per minute, in fact more damage per minute than the Super Conqueror. So yeah, this tank very powerful, and of course gets a good turret as well. It does have a big cupola which can be penned, so it's not as good as the Super Conqueror, but it does get 10 degrees of gun depression again, and yeah, you basically get the increased speed as well, which is definitely worth the while over the two previous heavy tanks. So it's worth the grind. The Chieftain Mark VI is probably the better of them all for an experienced player. But for a new player, the Super Conqueror every single day of the week, and also for a player that doesn't want to have to concentrate a whole lot when playing the game, even if you are more experienced and you just want to relax a little bit more, the Super Conqueror is going to be the tank that you want to play. So yeah, that's my opinion on those. And then we jump all the way back down to tier 5 to look at the tank destroyers, and this starts off with the unpennable AT2, which is actually tier for tier probably one of the most annoying tier 5s in the game, and tank destroyers in the game that has this ridiculous armor, because at tier 5 it has 203 millimeters of armor on the upper hull and the hull armor. It then gets really good space turret armor. It's actually angled at 45 degrees, which is basically unheard of at this tier. They don't even know what armor angling is. So players not only have to deal with the 152 millimeters of turret armor that you have that's also angled, which means it's actually probably more like 200 millimeters of armor. Yeah, I mean, this tank is just not fun to come up against in a tier 5 vehicle. It has super high damage per minute, but it does have the cupola, which is the key weak point and the thing that you want to be going for on the top of the vehicle, the cylindrical disc. So yeah, I mean, other than that, there is basically no weak points unless you get round to the side of the vehicle or the rear of the vehicle. Then yes, I mean, they are weak points too. But overall, this tank is ridiculous, and when you get it fully upgraded, it's slow, doesn't have any armor, doesn't have a turret, but this main armament up here is really, really rapid. I mean, 26 rounds a minute means you fire every 2.4 seconds, and that is just disgusting. It is disgusting to come up against, and it has okay penetration, and essentially it's a SEAL clubber's dream when it comes to heavily armoured tanks that are kind of a big middle finger to the opponents, and that's what the AT2 offers. And then you move on to the AT8, and the AT8 is a vehicle that has somewhat similar playstyle as the AT2, as the name would imply. It gets a big cupolas on the top of the vehicle. It actually gets worse armor tier for tier than the previous, and it gets this very flat plate which can essentially be premium rounded by basically everything that you come up against except from the tier 6s in the game. So yeah, it still has armor against tier 6, but up against the higher tiers it's basically, yeah, it's just no armor. But they can still pen your cupola anyway, that's the top of the vehicle, since it's pretty weak. And of course, because you don't have a turret and you're not particularly fast, they can get around the side of this vehicle and then just pen you there instead, and you will get tracked quite often in this thing and basically full health by light tanks like the Comet or the Cromwell, or you know, the equivalent light tanks. Of course, the Comet and the Cromwell being mediums, you know what I meant. But fast vehicles in the game that have high damage per minute will just ruin this thing if they can get around the side of you. But yeah, I really did enjoy it. Has some really good guns. I think that this one may even have an autoloader, which is like a super fast autoloader, but I don't know if they've removed that now off of the tank. It was either on the AT2 or the AT8 from memory. May even be on the AT7 actually, but I guess since we're talking about the AT7, we can have a look now. And the AT7 is a really kind of tank that I actually enjoyed playing, which is not said for very many vehicles in the game. And although the AT7 is very slow, it has the same sort of armor. I mean, it hasn't really improved since the lower tiers, and in fact it's probably got worse tier for tier again, since you do have a lot of places that are flat and can be penned by the premium rounds. And at this tier, 203mm, although it sounds like a lot, is actually not that much, considering that a lot of premium rounds, I mean the AT7 stock gun is able to actually go through the armor if it like hits it at a flat angle. So yeah, I mean, not particularly great. It doesn't really have a lower plate, so you don't have to worry about that, but it does have those huge cupolas on the top of the vehicle, visible to all, and you will get penned through them, as you will find out with the higher tier vehicles as well. But the 77 pounder or millimeter is actually pretty good, and then you get a 17 pounder which has the increased alpha and penetration, and then the top gun is actually a 20 pounder which has 10 rate of rounds per minute rate of fire, meaning that you can deal 2,300 base DPM, which is very good. It's a very good balance between having fast fire rates, so 6 seconds base reload, and also being able to deal a decent chunk of damage as well. So that's two really good things about this vehicle, and I've always enjoyed playing both of them. But I guess we can move on to the AT15, which is the tank that I really did like, and kind of got me into the feel for the vehicles. And if I was to go back and play the 87, I'd probably play it a lot more like this one, and vehicles below it, the 82, etc., because I've got the experience of the AT15. I feel like this is where you really flesh out how to play these vehicles, quite aggressive, but also you know, holding back when you need to at these late stages of the game, or if you are kind of worried about certain things, about being flanked, etc. But yeah, I mean, this thing, very, very powerful. The gun is amazing, and I mean amazing. And it also kind of, its armor, you don't have as big prominent cupolas as the previous one, so they can actually bounce a few rounds if people hit them at a weird angle. Remember, that's if they hit them at a weird angle. If they hit them at a normal angle, they will pen, as you'd expect. And you can also be penned in the mantlet of the vehicle, which is always fun as well. But for the most part, pretty decent tank, and I really do enjoy the AT15. I think it's a good starter to the line, doesn't get that much view range, but has the armor, has the damage per minute. Yeah, I mean, a very, very good tank. And then on to one of the best tank destroyers at tier 9 in the game, in my opinion, and the most fun tank destroyer I've ever played in the game, the Tortoise. Why is that? Well, it's because it has 400 alpha and reloads in 6 seconds. Yep, 400 alpha, 6 seconds, 3,916 damage per minute, and we haven't even got a commander in this thing, meaning that if we shove one in here, let me find one that is actually relevant to the vehicle. Here we go. Jump that one in there. 500 meters view range, you've got 400 alpha, and your reload is 5.18 seconds with 0.25 accuracy. And you're not actually that slow, especially if you put the speed boost equipment, which I'd highly recommend to increase the speed and the chassis and whole rotation speed, so you can turn quicker. And that's really what I use in this vehicle, as well as the view range to get to basically spot anyone that spots me. And yeah, I mean, this tank is absolutely perfect, and I love it every single day of the week. It has armor that, yes, it does have the cupola on the top of the vehicle. You can see it, much like the others. The cupola is a lot stronger than the lower tier vehicles, but it gets penned by basically everything. But don't worry about that, because you're dealing 400 alpha every 5 seconds, meaning every single heavy tank you come up against, you can basically hit them twice for every 1 shell that they'll fire at you. Since you have 800 alpha, that will mean that they're going to be probably 400 damage at least worse off than you will be. And yeah, they definitely don't have basically double the hit points that this tank has. So yeah, this tank is absolutely devastating, and even if you can use the HE rounds, which have 120 pen, you can make that damage per minute 515 damage every 5 seconds. Yeah, I mean, the damage per minute just goes through the roof, up to like 5,500 damage per minute. It's horrendously disgusting. So yeah, this tank is just godly. I love this tank. Is it for everyone? Probably not, but for a lot of people, this tank is actually really good, and it is worth the wait. Yeah, really good, solid tier 9 tank destroyer in the game. And then that leads on to 2 tanks. They're very, very contrasting in how they play. The FV217 Badger, which is the kind of more traditional to the line that you've just played. And this is essentially a heavily armoured version of the Tortoise. Think of it like that. It has 480 damage, so it doesn't reload anywhere near as quick. But it does have 7-second reload for 480 damage, has really good penetration on its standard rounds, as well as 330 with its premium. It gets much better HE rounds, being able to deal 620 damage with 130 pen. It gets 33 kilometers an hour max speed, which is a lot faster than the Tortoise, and its view range is similar, its still concealment is similar, and yeah, I just found this vehicle very, very horrible for a lot of people to come up against. And I mean, if you were to put a commander, it would basically have the same damage per minute as the Tortoise, but of course a tier higher, but the armor is just way better on the Badger, even if you get penned by basically everything anyway. You can see the damage per minute there, 4,646, but you can see the armor here. It still gets penned. The lower plate is just, although it is very thick and angled, just people's premium rounds is just way higher, to the point where you get penned basically every time. So kind of sucks in that regard, but think of it almost like a J Panther. Yeah, it's kind of like that, but a little bit better armor, of course, tier for tier. But yeah, still a very, very good tank and one that I enjoy playing. And then the completely off the track vehicle that is completely nothing like the vehicles that you've just played in the entire tech tree, the FV215B183, the 183mm Derpa, which has, of course, 1450 damage on its HL or Hesh rounds, the high explosive squashed head, or the 1150 damage on its standard AP rounds. And of course, you trade off the penetration for the extra damage, or you can trade off even more penetration for even more damage on its HE rounds with 1650 alpha damage. But still, very, very powerful vehicles, and I've always enjoyed playing these things. I think that the armor is pretty good. I mean, you can bounce a little bit off of the turret, but it's still very flat and gets penned by basically everything. So although it has armor, it doesn't really. And remember, it's sat on the FV215B, the tank that we looked at earlier, just has that big turret on top of it. So the weak point below the turret is also a weak point, so if it tries side scraping with this thing, you can pen it there. And of course, yeah, being rear mounted, it can come around a corner and not try and avoid exposing that lower plate, which is a big weak point of this vehicle. But yeah, a really fun one, a big old Derpa, and yeah, a tank that I haven't played an inordinate amount of time with, but it has the same gun as a tank that I have played a ton with, which is the FV4005 Stage 2, which is the big boy and the one that I absolutely love and managed to 3-mark at some point. I have no idea what percentage we're at now, but it's probably 90 something. But still, this vehicle, very, very good. Let's jump back down to tier 5, however, because this starts on a different tech tree line. And there are two options. You've got the Sherman 3 and the Archer. In my opinion, I'd go with the Sherman since it's a little bit new player friendly and is probably more like what you'd expect from some of the mediums at the tier. The Archer goes faster backwards than it does forwards, so yeah, it's weird, and it's probably the only tank in the game that is the case. I mean, it is such a weird vehicle. I should probably do a video on it, but you can see if wherever the speed is, yeah, 32 kilometers an hour backwards, 12 kilometers an hour forwards, and it's not particularly very good. So the Sherman 3 is the way to go. Yeah, just a much better, more consistent tank that you'll be able to deal damage in. And then that leads on to the Firefly. So this is the Sherman Firefly. It's essentially a Sherman that is, yeah, it's basically an American Sherman at tier 6. It's nothing spectacular, but it has, you know, fast fire rate, good kind of good mobility, good accuracy, but yeah, other than that, nothing particularly special, and it gets penned by absolutely everything, and is the KV2's dream to see in the game. But other than that, you've got the Achilles, which is probably better tier for tier than the Firefly, but you know, you have to play the Archer, so is it really that much better? But either way, two vehicles, really, really enjoyable, and I think they're both, you know, relatively okay. They have fast fire rates, you know what it is, and of course sitting back and using them is the way to go. But then you lead on to the Challenger, which is probably one of the best tier 7 tank destroyers in the game, and yet again a tank that I decided to 3-mark, and that is because the Top Gun of this thing is unbelievably good. 32 pounder with 280 damage that reloads so quickly, 6.73 second reload for 2,500 damage per minute, has really good view range, good steel concealment, it's fast, it does 52 kilometers an hour. Think of this like a Comet that has better turret armor, because, you know, of course it has better turret armor. It gets a weird turret back point. I mean, it has more armor on the back of the turret than it does on the front. So, you know, it's a memer. It doesn't get any actual armor on the hull armor, but you know, this tank is very, very good, and I highly recommend every single player wanting to get a tank destroyer actually picks up the Challenger, because it will teach you so much about gun depression and using it, as well as having the mobility and the concealment as well. It just basically has everything that you need to know, and it is a great learning vehicle to master tank destroyers. And yeah, I mean, it's just brilliant. And then you move on to the Charioteer. So this is a tank that has the first kind of Hesh rounds in the Tank Destroyer line, and it has the 210 pen with 480 alpha. So we talked about the Centurion Action X in the FV4202. Well, this has the same gun as the FV4202. So this has the 210 pen, 480 alpha. It's probably got slightly worse damage per minute than the Action X and the FV4202, but it is 2 tiers lower, and of course is a very good vehicle. Yet again, has the like the Comet's main armor in the hull armor to be able to get into position. 52 kilometers an hour, perfect. View range, perfect. Still concealment, very good as well. I'd highly recommend you run a camo build on these vehicles with advanced concealment and advanced optics, as well as running an advanced loader to boost up the damage per minute, because that is just crucial. And yeah, just a really good tank. Do I think is overpowered? No. Is it as good tier for tier as the Challenger? No. But overall, very good. And then you lead on to the FV4004, which is the Conway. And the Conway is actually an interesting one, because you have two choices with this vehicle. You have a 120mm or you have a BL 5.5 incher. Now, 5.5 inches in standard terms is relatively, average. But in World of Tanks, a 5.5 incher is a lot bigger. And of course, in doing that, you got 600 alpha damage that also gets Hesh. And that means that you can deal 770 total damage with the top gun of this thing, which is amazing. And it also gets a decent amount of penetration, which means that it's kind of a derp. You're not guaranteed to pen everything, but if you do use it, it's good. But, if you're wanting to be more consistent, maybe taking the 400 alpha is probably going to be a better option. But at the end of the day, it's down to you and your playstyle. Do you want to have the big alpha kind of hard hitting, or do you want to be more annoying and kind of getting in there up close and personal? Turret armor doesn't have any armor. The speed of the tank is 40 kilometers an hour, so it's not sluggish. It is okay, but of course you sacrifice your armor in order to get that 40 kilometers an hour. It doesn't turn particularly amazingly fast, so it really does rely on that main armament, and you can see the armor here basically not having any. And then that leads on to the FV4005 Stage 2, which is the Tier 10 tank destroyer that you saw earlier, which I absolutely love. And that's because it just has everything you need, really. It doesn't get everything you need, but it's got 38 kilometers an hour, so it's not super slow. It has the 1450 alpha damage Hesh rounds, which are more than enough for most tanks in the game if you're aiming at the weak points, or 310 penetration with the 1150 alpha. So I do take a few AP rounds, and then for those really lightly armoured vehicles, the 92mm of HE that you get with the vehicle with 1650 alpha is always there for things like bat chats or light tanks in the game. That's what they're for, and for those moments when you come up against the rear of the vehicle. And actually in this vehicle, instead of running, optics or stuff like that, I actually run the advanced reload perk to be able to switch between my rounds, so that if I do ever somehow surprisingly come up against the back of a vehicle, I can swap to the HE rounds and deal the extra damage over some of the other vehicles. And of course with the improved ventilation and advanced loader to just basically boost up every other aspect of this tank, so that we can have a decent level of accuracy and damage per minute and view range and aim time, and the list goes on. It also gets 10 degrees gun depression, so it's a little bit more flexible than its counterpart in the FV215B. And personally, the FV4005 is the tank I'd go for if I was trying to pick the 183 to pick. And the grind, yeah, I mean, they're two completely different grinds. One's a paper tank destroyer grind, the other is a heavily armoured but very inflexible tank destroyer line. So pick your poison and then go for it. And that sums up this video. We're not going to look at artillery because we all know what we think about artillery pieces, and although the Conqueror GC is probably my second choice tier 10 artillery in the game, kind of kinged by the T92, I guess, but yeah, still, very good artillery. I haven't played the whole tech tree line for the artillery pieces. I'm never going to do that. but there you go. That is the British tech tree line. I hope you guys did enjoy. Of course, don't forget you can check out any of the other tech trees that we've done so far, including Germany, Soviet tech tree, the Americans, the French, and I think we've done the Czech tech tree as well as the Swedish tech tree. So there's only a few left to go, so stick by for that full video, and then we'll start looking at premium vehicles in the game as well at the end. But other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, and I hope you join me back in a next video by subscribing to the channel, and thank you. Goodbye.